The UES Perseverance sat in Dry Dock 7 like a forgotten beast. Her hull scratched and dented from battles that most species had already forgotten about. Her engines cold and silent while newer ships hummed past her with their glowing blue drives and seamless chrome bodies. Commander Elena Vasquez stood on the observation deck and looked at her ship, and she felt the familiar mix of pride and frustration that had become her constant companion since the Admiralty had assigned her here 6 months ago. The Perseverance was old. There was no denying that. She had been built 70 years ago during the first expansion war, when humanity was still learning how to fight among the stars. And back then they had built ships the only way they knew how, with thick armor and manual controls and crews large enough to handle every system by hand. Now the galaxy had moved on. The Coalition's newest cruisers were works of art, sleek and beautiful, run by artificial intelligences so advanced that a single ship needed only a dozen crew members to operate. Neural interfaces allowed pilots to think commands directly into their vessels, and predictive algorithms calculated battle strategies faster than any biological mind could follow. The Perseverance had none of these things. She had 347 crew members doing jobs that modern ships handled automatically. She had physical buttons and switches and screens that displayed information for human eyes to read. She had targeting systems that required a gunner to actually aim and fire rather than letting a computer handle everything. Other captains laughed at her. Elena knew this because she had heard them. They called the Perseverance a museum piece and retirement home and a ship for officers who had disappointed the Admiralty one too many times. They were not entirely wrong about that last. But Elena had commanded a modern destroyer once, the UES Swift Current, and she had been good at her job. But she had also questioned orders that she believed were wrong, and she had spoken too loudly about policies she disagreed with. And eventually, someone had decided that she needed to be put somewhere out of the way, where she could not cause trouble. So here she was, captain of a ship that nobody wanted, leading a crew of misfits and veterans and young officers who had drawn the short straw in their assignments. Her first officer, Lieutenant Commander James Okonkwo, walked up beside her and followed her gaze to the Perseverance. "She does not look like much, does she?" he said quietly. "No," Elena admitted, "but she is ours, and she still flies, and that has to count for something." James nodded, but his expression remained doubtful, and Elena could not blame him for that doubt because she felt it herself. Sometimes, late at night, when she wondered if her career would ever recover from this assignment, the alert came. 3 days later, Elena was in her quarters, reviewing crew evaluations, when the ship-wide alarm began to wail and she was on her feet and running toward the bridge. Before the first cycle had finished, "Report," she demanded as she burst through the bridge. Doors Lieutenant Sarah Park looked up from the communications console, and her face was pale in a way that made Elena's stomach tighten with dread. "Commander, we are receiving emergency transmissions from Coalition Command. The Dominion of Keth has attacked the outer colonies, and they have issued an ultimatum: surrender or face complete annihilation." Elena felt cold spread through her chest because she knew about the Keth. Everyone did. They were one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. Technological masters who had conquered 100 worlds over 10,000 years. And for the last century, they had watched humanity's expansion with growing irritation. "What is the Coalition's response?" Elena asked. "The combined fleet is mobilizing." Sarah replied, "Every modern warship in the sector is moving to intercept the Keth forces." "And us?" Sarah hesitated, and that hesitation told Elena everything she needed to know. "We have received no orders, Commander." Of course they had not. Why would the Admiralty summon an obsolete relic when they had hundreds of gleaming, AI-integrated warships to send into battle? The Perseverance would only slow them down and get in the way. Elena sat in her command chair and watched the tactical display as the Coalition fleet assembled. It was an impressive sight, over 200 ships of the line, the most advanced vessels that humanity and their allies had ever built. Surely such a force could handle whatever the Keth threw at them. The battle began 4 hours later. Elena and her crew watched the feeds in silence as the combined fleet moved into engagement range with the Keth Armada. The Coalition ships outnumbered the enemy nearly 2-1, and their commanders radiated confidence in their transmissions. Then the Keth activated their weapon. It happened so fast that Elena almost missed it. One moment the Coalition fleet was advancing in perfect formation. The next moment every ship had gone dark. Drives failing and weapons powering down and communications cutting off mid-sentence. What happened? James breathed beside her. The answer came from the science station, where Ensign David Chen was frantically analyzing the data streams. Neural disruption, he said, and his voice shook. The Keth have deployed some kind of neural disruption weapon. It targets AI cores and neural interfaces simultaneously. Every integrated system in the fleet has been shut down. The crews, Elena said. What about the crews? David's face went gray. Dead commander. Anyone with a neural interface would have experienced a massive feedback surge directly into their brain. At this range with this intensity, he did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. Elena stared at the display where 200 of humanity's finest warships now drifted as lifeless hulks, and she understood, with terrible clarity, what had just happened. The Keth had not simply defeated the Coalition fleet. They had built a weapon specifically designed to exploit everything that made modern civilization function. Every advantage that the galaxy had spent centuries developing had just become a fatal weakness. The emergency channel crackled to life, and a desperate voice filled the bridge. This is Coalition Command. To any vessel still operational, please respond. We have lost contact with the combined fleet. Repeat, we have lost contact with all ships. Any vessel that can still fight, please respond. Elena looked around her bridge at her crew. 347 humans operating a ship with no AI core, and no neural interfaces and no connection to any of the systems that the Keth weapon targeted. They had manual controls and physical displays and brains safely encased in bone with no technological bridges to exploit Commander. James said slowly as the same realization dawned on his face. We are still operational. Elena nodded and felt something shift inside her. Something that had been sleeping for a long time. The Coalition's modern fleet was dead, and the Keth were coming, and humanity's only hope was a ship that everyone had called obsolete. She opened a channel to Coalition Command. This is Commander Elena Vasquez of the UES Perseverance. We read you and we are operational. What are your orders? The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Perseverance. The voice came back thick with disbelief and desperate hope. You are ordered to proceed to the following coordinates and await further instructions. You may be all we have left. Elena closed the channel and looked at her crew, and for the first time in months she did not see misfits and cast-offs. She saw survivors. You heard them, she said. All hands prepare for departure. It seems we are not obsolete after all. The emergency assembly chamber on Station Omega was filled with representatives from across the Coalition, and none of them looked happy to see the Perseverance on the main display. Ambassador Kethral of the Vithani Consortium made a wet clicking sound that passed for laughter among his species and pointed one of his 6 arms at the holographic image of the old warship. You cannot be serious, he said. This is your response to the greatest military disaster in Coalition history. A vessel that belongs in a salvage yard, crewed by 300 biological units, performing tasks that a single AI could handle in its sleep cycle. Admiral. Chun stood at the podium, and his jaw was tight with barely controlled anger, but his voice remained steady. 347 crew members, Ambassador, and yes, they are all we have left. Every ship with integrated AI systems is vulnerable to the Keth neural weapon. The Perseverance has no such systems. Then it has no chance, another ambassador declared. The Keth will simply destroy it with conventional weapons. Perhaps, Admiral. Chun replied, or perhaps you have all forgotten what humans were capable of before we started relying on machines to do everything for us. The first engagement came 2 days later. The Perseverance dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Keth advance fleet, and immediately 5 enemy cruisers turned to face her. Their sleek predatory shapes making the old human vessel look even more ungainly by comparison, Commander. Vasquez watched them approach on the main viewer and felt her crew tense around her. Tactical analysis, she ordered Lieutenant Commander Okonkwo. Studied his console and shook his head. 5 ships, Commander. Each one has roughly twice our firepower. Their shields are more advanced, and their drives are faster. By any reasonable calculation, we should not survive this engagement. Good thing humans have never been reasonable then, Elena replied. All hands battle stations. Engineering, give me everything you have. Gunnery, prepare kinetic rounds. The Keth ships did not bother trying to communicate. They simply attacked, and the first thing they did was activate their neural disruption weapon at maximum power. Elena felt something brush against the edge of her mind like static electricity on a dry day, and then it was gone. Around her, the bridge crew blinked and shook their heads, but nothing else happened. Report, she called out. Weapon had no effect, Commander Ensign. Chum reported from the science station, and there was wonder in his voice. Our systems are completely isolated. There is nothing for it to disrupt on the Keth flagship, Commander. Varteth stared at his tactical display in confusion because the human vessel should be dead. Its crew should be dying as feedback surges destroyed their neural pathways, but the ship was still moving, and now it was turning to face him. He hesitated for exactly 0.3 of a second. In that time, Lieutenant Marcus Webb was already running calculations at his station, using methods that predated computers by centuries. His pencil moved across paper as he factored in distance and velocity and the rotation of both vessels. And when he had his answer, he called it out loud and clear. Firing solution ready. Target the lead cruiser, center mass. Gunnery Sergeant Yuki. Tanaka heard the numbers, and her hands moved across physical controls that responded to her touch. Deep in the ship, massive mechanisms shifted and turned, and loaded a kinetic round the size of a small ground car into the main cannon. Weapon ready, she reported, Commander. Vasquez did not hesitate. Fire. The round left the cannon at 3% the speed of light. A solid slug of ultra-dense metal that crossed the distance between the ships in less than a heartbeat. It hit the Keth flagship dead center, and the shields that were designed to stop energy weapons barely slowed it down. Commander Verteth was still processing his confusion when his ship became an expanding cloud of superheated gas and shattered metal. The other 4 Keth ships stopped their advance for a long moment. Nothing happened, and Elena could almost feel the enemy commanders trying to understand what had just occurred. Their greatest weapon had failed, and their flagship had been destroyed by a ship that should not have been able to touch them. Continue firing, Elena ordered. Target the next ship. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes when it was over 4 Keth. Cruisers had been reduced to debris, and the 5th was fleeing at maximum speed. The Perseverance had taken hits, and her hull was scorched in several places, but she was still flying, and her crew was still alive. The transmission they received from Coalition Command was almost incoherent with relief and disbelief. Back on station, Omega, the ambassadors watched the battle recordings in stunned silence. Ambassador Kethril was no longer laughing. How? He finally managed to ask. How did they do that? Admiral Chun allowed himself a small smile. The Perseverance has a crew of 3. 147, because humans never trusted machines to do what humans could do themselves. Every system on that ship has a manual override. Every calculation can be done by hand. Every function has multiple backups that do not require electronic systems to operate. He pointed at the display where the Perseverance was now being hailed. As a hero by the surviving coalition forces, we built that ship during a time when we did not have an eye to rely on. When every task required human hands and human minds, other species thought we were inefficient and wasteful for keeping so many crew members on a single vessel. They thought we were foolish for refusing to fully integrate our neural systems. With our technology, Admiral Chun's smile grew wider. The Keth built their entire military strategy around technological superiority. They developed a weapon that could destroy any enemy that relied on advanced systems, but they never considered that someone might simply choose not to rely on those systems. He turned to face the assembled ambassadors. The Perseverance is not a relic or a museum piece. It is a reminder of what humans can do when we cannot depend on anything except ourselves. And right now, it is the only thing standing between the Keth and everything we have built. On the Perseverance, Commander Vasquez gathered her crew in the main cargo bay because it was the only space large enough to hold all of them, and she looked at their faces and saw something that had not been there before. Pride. "I will not lie to you," she said. "What we just did was only the beginning. The Keth will adapt, and they will come at us with conventional weapons, and they will not underestimate us again. This war is going to be long and hard, and some of us will not survive it." She paused and let her words sink in. "But today, we proved something important. We proved that all the technology in the galaxy cannot replace human courage and human skill and human determination. They called us obsolete, and they were wrong. We are not obsolete. We are exactly what the galaxy needs right now." The crew cheered, and the sound filled the cargo bay and echoed through the corridors of the old ship. Chief Engineer Omar Hassan patted a bulkhead affectionately and spoke to no one in particular. "You hear that, old girl? You are not done yet, not by a long way." And somewhere deep in the ship, the reactor hummed a little louder as if in response. The war had just begun. But for the first time since the disaster at the outer colonies, humanity had hope, and that hope was carried by a ship that everyone had given up on, and a crew that refused to accept that they were finished. Keth had won every war they had ever fought by being more advanced than their enemies. They had never faced an enemy that considered advancement itself to be optional. 3 months into the war, and the Perseverance had become something more than a ship. She had become a legend commander. Elena Vasquez reviewed the latest damage reports in her ready room and tried not to think about how tired she was. The ship had been in almost constant combat since that first engagement, and the wear was showing on both the vessel and her. Crew the Keth had adapted quickly after their initial defeat. They had stopped relying on their neural weapons against human targets and had switched to conventional warfare. Plasma lances that could melt through hull plating, antimatter warheads that could crack a ship in half, kinetic swarms that filled space with deadly projectiles, but conventional. Weapons required conventional tactics, and humanity had been practicing those for 10,000 years. The Perseverance fought a guerrilla war across Keth-controlled space. She would drop out of faster than light travel, strike hard at supply lines and communication relays, and then disappear before enemy reinforcements could arrive. She was never where the Keth expected her to be, and she hit targets that they thought were too well defended to attack. The crew had changed in those 3 months. Elena remembered the misfits and malcontents who had been assigned to her ship back at Dry Dock 7, and she barely recognized them now. Somewhere along the way they had stopped being a collection of individuals and had become something else entirely. Something older and more primal. Lieutenant Commander Okonkwo called it tribal. "We stopped being co-workers," he explained to Elena one evening when they were reviewing navigation charts. "Now we are family." I would die for anyone on this ship, and I know they would do the same for me. Elena nodded because she felt it too. The bond that formed when you faced death together day after day. When you trusted your life to the person standing next to you, and they trusted their life to you in return, Chief. Engineer Omar Hassan kept the ship running through sheer stubbornness and creative engineering. The reactor had been damaged in the Battle of Varus Station, and proper repairs would have required a full dry dock. But Omar did not have access to a dry dock, so he made do with salvage parts and improvised solutions. She will hold, he promised. Elena every time she asked about the engine's status, and his voice never wavered even when the ship groaned and shuddered around them. She's stubborn. Like us. Dr. Sarah Chun worked miracles in the medical bay with nothing but surgical tools and her steady hands. There were no regeneration pods on the Perseverance, and no nano-healers, and no AI-assisted diagnostic systems. Just one doctor and 2 medics doing everything manually. Casualties mounted as the war dragged on. Elena learned to visit the wounded between battles, to sit by their beds and hold their hands and tell them that their sacrifice mattered. Some of them recovered and returned to duty, and some of them did not, and each loss felt like a piece of her own soul being torn away. But the crew never broke Scout Pilot. Alexander Petrov proved that better than anyone. His fighter was shot down over Keth Prime during a reconnaissance mission, and everyone assumed he was dead. But 11 days later, they received a transmission on an encrypted frequency that only Petrov knew. Still alive. His voice crackled through the static. Enemy forces everywhere, but I have what we came for. Requesting extraction at the following coordinates. Elena sent a shuttle immediately despite the risk. And when they brought Petrov back to the Perseverance, he was 17 pounds lighter than when he had left, and he was missing 3 fingers from his right hand, and his eyes had the haunted look of someone who had seen too much, but he was smiling as he handed Elena a data chip. Got their defensive network codes, he said. Cost me some fingers, but I figured it was a fair trade. Elena hugged him right there in the shuttle bay in front of everyone, and she did not care about protocol or appearances, because this man had survived 11 days behind enemy lines, eating nothing but emergency ration, paced and hiding from patrols, and building a radio from crash shuttle parts so he could call for help. This was what humans could do when they refused to give up. The Keth High Command had studied human psychology extensively. They knew that biological creatures could be broken with enough pressure and enough pain and enough loss. They expected the Perseverance crew to crack, eventually to surrender or flee or simply fall apart under the strain. What they did not understand was that humans did not break that way. When you pushed a human hard enough, something strange happened. Instead of shattering, they became harder, stronger, more determined. The same pressure that would destroy a brittle material only served to forge a human into something unbreakable. Lieutenant Marcus Webb lost his brother when the Keth destroyed a refugee convoy. He did not collapse in grief. He channeled his pain into his work, and his firing solutions became even more precise, and his hands never shook, even when he was calculating the destruction of the ships that had killed his family. Gunnery Sergeant Yuki Tanaka watched her best friend die in her arms after a direct hit to their weapons bay. She did not ask to be relieved of duty. She cleaned the blood from her station and kept firing, and later that night she cried alone in her quarters. But when morning came, she was back at her post, ready to fight again. The crew of the Perseverance had learned a truth that the Keth, with all their advanced technology, could never understand. Humans were not strong despite their pain and their loss and their fear. They were strong because of every sacrifice made them more determined to ensure that sacrifice meant something. Every death added weight to their cause and steel to their resolve. They fought not just for victory, but for the memory of everyone they had lost along the way. By the end of the third month, the Perseverance had destroyed or disabled 47 Keth vessels. She had disrupted supply lines across 3 sectors and had gathered intelligence that would prove invaluable in the battles to come, but more importantly, she had given humanity something to believe in across coalition space. People told stories about the old ship and her crew. They talked about the impossible victories and the daring raids and the sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Children played games where they pretended to be crew members of the Perseverance, and adults raised glasses in toast to the ship's continued survival. The legend grew with every passing day, and somewhere in the depths of Keth-controlled space, the Perseverance kept fighting, battered and scarred but unbroken, her crew exhausted but unbowed, carrying the hope of an entire species on their shoulders. Commander Vasquez looked at the navigation charts and plotted their next course and allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. They had not won the war yet, but they were still fighting, and as long as they were fighting, there was still a chance. The Keth had expected humanity to surrender after losing their fleet. Instead, they had created something far more dangerous than any fleet could ever be. They had created a symbol, and symbols could not be destroyed by plasma lances or antimatter warheads or kinetic swarm. Symbols could only be destroyed by making people stop believing in them, and the crew of the Perseverance had given humanity every reason to keep believing. The Perseverance dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Keth home system, and for a long moment there was only silence on the bridge. Commander Elena Vasquez looked at the tactical display and counted the enemy ships. 73 warships arranged in defensive formations around Keth Prime, each one larger and more powerful than the Perseverance, each one crewed by beings who wanted nothing more than to see her ship destroyed. Lieutenant Commander Okonkwo spoke first, and his voice was carefully neutral. Commander, we are significantly outgunned here, I noticed. Elena replied without taking her eyes off the display. Our chances of surviving a direct engagement are essentially 0. I know. Then why are we here? Elena turned to face her bridge crew and saw the questions in their eyes. They trusted her, and they would follow her orders, even unto death, but they deserved to understand why she was asking them to fly into what looked like certain destruction. We are here because this war cannot be won with firepower alone, she said. The Keth have more ships than we do, and they can build new ones faster than we can destroy them. Even with our victories over the past months, we have not weakened them enough to force a surrender. She brought up a new display showing the data that Alexander Petrov had risked his life to retrieve. But we have something they do not expect us to have. We have evidence. The display showed sensor logs from the Battle of the Coalition Fleet, recordings that captured the exact moment when the Keth had activated their neural weapon, and more importantly, recordings that showed what that weapon had done to its victims. The Keth used a prohibited weapon against the combined fleet. Elena explained, the neural disruption technology they deployed does not distinguish between military and civilian targets. When they fired it, they killed not just our soldiers, but the millions of civilians whose neural implants made them vulnerable. Passenger ships that were nowhere near the battle zone, space stations full of families, merchant vessels carrying innocent traders. Lieutenant Sarah Park gasped as she realized what Elena was saying. That is a war crime, she whispered. Under every treaty in existence. Yes, it is. Elena agreed. And the Keth have been very careful to keep that fact hidden. They destroyed all the evidence they could find, and they silenced anyone who might talk. But they did not know we were recording, and they did not know that our recordings would survive. She pressed a button and the communications array came to life. We are not here to fight. We are here to broadcast. Right now, the Perseverance is transmitting those recordings to every inhabited system in the galaxy. Every species that has ever been threatened by the Keth is going to see exactly what kind of weapon they are willing to use. And when they see it, they will have to make a choice. The bridge crew understood now. We are making allies, Okonkwo said slowly, not by asking for help, but by showing everyone what the Keth really are. Exactly. The Keth have controlled this region of space for 10,000 years because no one wanted to stand against them alone. But if everyone stands together, then suddenly the odds look very different. The response from the Keth came exactly as Elena had expected. Massive holographic display flickered, and the face of the Keth hegemon appeared before them. He was a towering crystalline being with faceted eyes that reflected light in unsettling patterns, and when he spoke, his voice resonated with the absolute certainty of someone who had ruled unchallenged. For centuries, human vessel, you will cease your transmission immediately and surrender. Your crew will be taken alive and studied. Your species will be preserved as specimens in our biological archives. This is not a negotiation. It is a statement of fact. Elena smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Hegemon, I appreciate the offer, but I think I will have to decline. You see, we are a bit busy at the moment sharing your secrets with the entire galaxy, and I would hate to interrupt such important work. The hegemon's crystalline features somehow managed to convey rage. You believe this changes anything. We are the Keth. We have crushed civilizations older than your species. Your recordings will accomplish nothing except to make your deaths more painful. Perhaps, Elena acknowledged, but let me ask you something. How many of your allies knew about the neural weapon? How many of them understood that you were willing to kill billions of civilians to win a single battle? I suspect quite a few of them are going to have questions after they see our broadcast. She did not wait for the hegemon to respond. She simply closed the channel. All hands prepare for incoming fire, she announced calmly. This is going to get rough. The Keth fleet opened fire with everything they had. The next 11 hours were the longest of Elena's life. The Perseverance was hit again and again. Compartments were vented, and systems failed, and crew members died at their stations. But the ship kept moving, and the broadcast kept transmitting, and slowly, impossibly, word began to spread by. The fifth hour, the first independent transmissions started arriving from other systems. Species that have been bullied and threatened by the Keth for generations finally found the courage to speak out. They confirmed receiving the broadcast, and they expressed their outrage, and they demanded answers. By the 8th hour, the Keth hegemony's allies began quietly withdrawing their support. Trade agreements were suspended, and mutual defense pacts were put on hold, and ambassadors suddenly became very difficult to reach by. The 11th hour, the Perseverance was barely functional. Her hull was torn open in a dozen places, and her crew had been reduced from 347 to less than 100. And her engines were running on nothing but Omar Hassan's stubborn refusal to let them fail. But the Keth fleet had stopped firing, not because they had run out of ammunition, but because they had run out of justification. With the whole galaxy watching every shot they fired only proved that the recordings were true. Every attempt to destroy the Perseverance only made them look more guilty. Commander Vasquez stood on her shattered bridge, supported by 2 ensigns, because her legs could no longer hold her weight. And she looked at the main viewer where the Keth warships hung motionless in space. We did not beat them with firepower, she said softly. We beat them with a story. And now everyone knows it. Lieutenant Commander Okonkwo nodded, even though his left arm hung useless at his side and blood dripped from a cut above his eye. What happens now, Commander? Elena thought about that question for a long moment. Now we wait, she finally answered. The galaxy knows the truth, and that truth is going to spread faster than any fleet could travel. The Keth will have to answer for what they have done, and their enemies will have to decide whether they want to keep being afraid. She looked at the surviving members of her crew and felt a wave of love and pride so strong it almost overwhelmed her. "We came here expecting to die," she told them, "and maybe we still will. But we have done something that no amount of weapons could ever achieve. We have changed the story, and stories are more powerful than any fleet ever built." The Perseverance hung in space, battered and broken, but undefeated around her, the galaxy was waking up to a new reality, and somewhere in the depths of his fortress, the Keth hegemon was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. He had tried to destroy an obsolete ship with an expendable crew. Instead, he had created martyrs, and martyrs were far more dangerous than any weapon of war. 3 months after the 11-hour battle, the Perseverance returned to Keth Prime. She was no longer alone. Behind her flew 200 warships from 18 different species. Some were modern vessels with gleaming hulls and advanced drives, and others were ancient craft, pulled out of museums and retirement facilities. But every single one of them had something in common. They were all crewed by biological beings, operating manual controls. The BROADCAST had changed everything, just as Commander Vasquez had hoped. Species that had spent centuries fearing the Keth suddenly found their courage when they realized that the neural weapon could be countered. Old grudges were remembered, and new alliances were formed, and a coalition larger than any in galactic history assembled, with a single purpose, and the Keth hegemony forever. Commander Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Perseverance and looked at the fleet arrayed behind her through the main viewer. Her ship had been repaired as much as possible, but she still bore the scars of that terrible 11-hour battle, and she probably always would. Some scars you carried with pride. The Allied fleet advanced toward Keth Prime in perfect formation, and the remaining Keth forces fell back before them, unable to stand against such overwhelming numbers. One by one, the defensive stations went silent, and the orbital platforms surrendered, and the path to the planet itself lay open. But the hegemon had one final card to play. Lieutenant Marcus Webb's voice cut through the tense silence on the bridge. "Commander, I am detecting unusual energy readings from the planet's core. The signature matches theoretical models for a quantum collapse device." Elena felt her blood run cold because she knew what that meant. A dead man switch. Okonkwo said grimly, "If we attack the surface, the whole planet goes up and takes everything within 3 light minutes with it." The Allied fleet halted, and Elena could hear the urgent communications passing between the other commanders as they argued about what to do. Some wanted to withdraw and accept a negotiated settlement. Others suggested that they should simply bombard the planet from outside the blast radius and accept the losses. A few quietly proposed that the death of Keth Prime might be worth it to end the threat forever. Elena listened to the debate for exactly 4 minutes, and then she made her decision. She opened a channel to the hegemon, and his crystalline face appeared on her screen once again, but this time there was something different in his expression, something that looked almost like desperation hiding behind the arrogance. "You built your empire on fear," Elena said calmly. "Fear of your weapons, and fear of your technology, and fear of what you could do to anyone who stood against you." The hegemon's voice dripped with contempt, even as his forces crumbled around him. "And now you see the culmination of that fear, human. Approach my world, and we all die together. Your precious fleet and my people and everything within range. I may lose, but I will ensure that you lose more." Elena shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "You still do not understand us. We are not afraid of dying. We never were." She turned to face her crew and saw them watching her with complete trust in their eyes. They had followed her through impossible battles and hopeless odds and near certain death more times than she could count. They knew what she was about to ask of them, and not one of them flinched. "All hands," she announced. "Prepare for atmospheric entry. We are going down." The bridge erupted in activity as the crew moved to their stations, but there was no panic and no hesitation. They had accepted long ago that this mission might be their last, and they had made peace with that possibility. The Allied fleet transmitted frantic warnings as the Perseverance broke formation and began her descent toward Keth Prime, but Elena ignored them. She kept her eyes fixed on the viewer, where the planet grew larger and larger with each passing second. The hegemon screamed threats and promises of destruction through the communication channel, but Elena detected something new in his voice now. "Here, you are bluffing," he declared. "No creature would willingly sacrifice itself in this manner. You value your own survival above all else. I have studied your species." Elena smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had seen too much to be afraid of anything anymore. "You studied our biology and our psychology and our society, but you missed the most important thing about us. We are the species that walks into burning buildings to save strangers. We are the species that throws itself on grenades to protect our friends. We are the species that would rather die on our feet than live on our knees." The Perseverance hit the atmosphere, and her hull began to glow as friction heated the outer plating to incredible temperatures. "You have one chance," Elena continued. "Deactivate your weapon and surrender. Or we will fly this ship directly into your fortress, and we will both discover whether you're dead. Man switch works as well as you think it does." She saw it in his eyes the moment his nerve broke. The hegemon was a creature of calculation and logic and survival. He had built his empire through careful manipulation and strategic thinking. He understood threats and he understood power, but he had never truly understood sacrifice. He could not comprehend a being that would genuinely choose death over surrender. "You are insane," he whispered. "No," Elena replied as the fortress grew closer in the viewer. "We are human." The dead man's switch was deactivated. 30 seconds before impact, the fortress shields dropped and the planetary defenses went offline and across Keth Prime. The war machines fell silent as the hegemony surrendered unconditionally. The Perseverance pulled up at the last possible moment, her engines screaming in protest, and she climbed back into orbit, trailing smoke and flame, but still flying, always flying, refusing to stop until the very end. In the aftermath, the galaxy struggled to find the right word for what had happened. Some called it a victory, but that seemed too simple for something so profound. The Perseverance had not just won a battle or even a war. She had destroyed an idea. She had taken the concept of Keth supremacy and erased it so completely that nothing remained. Erased became the term that stuck. The Keth hegemony was not conquered or defeated or overthrown. It was erased, wiped from the face of galactic politics as if it had never existed. And in its place, something new began to grow. Something built on cooperation and mutual respect rather than fear and domination. The Perseverance was finally retired 6 months later, but not to a salvage yard or a museum. Instead, she was placed in a memorial orbit around Earth, where she could be seen from the surface on clear nights. A permanent reminder of what one ship and one crew had accomplished against impossible odds. Visitors came from across the galaxy to see her. Pilgrims who wanted to touch her scarred hull and stand where her crew had stood. They came to understand how such an old and outdated vessel had changed the course of history. Commander Elena Vasquez gave one interview before she retired from service. "They called us obsolete," she said, and her voice carried the weight of everything she had witnessed and survived. "And maybe we were in some ways. We could not interface directly with computers, and we could not process information at neural speeds, and we could not do any of the things that modern civilizations considered essential. She paused and looked at something beyond the camera, something that only she could see. But we could do one thing that no one else could. We could choose to die and mean it. We could look at certain destruction and walk toward it without hesitation because we believed that some things were worth more than our own survival. Her smile was tired, but genuine. That is the most terrifying weapon in the universe. Not plasma lances or antimatter warheads or neural disruption fields. Just a simple willingness to sacrifice everything for what you believe in. The Keth never understood that, and it destroyed them. The ship they called outdated never fired. The shot that ended the war, she did not. After she just refused to stop, and in the end that was enough. The galaxy would remember the perseverance not as a weapon of destruction, but as a symbol of hope. Proof that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seemed to her. Crew would be honored as heroes for generations to come, and somewhere among the stars humanity would continue to do what it had always done: survive and fight. And never ever give up, because that was what humans were. That was what humans would always be, the species that refused to accept the impossible, the species that made the impossible possible, the species that the galaxy had learned never to underestimate again.